In the United States, we have the luxury of freedom of the press written into the law of the land. The press can mostly write whatever it wants, even stuff that isn't real. But this is not true for other countries, and this is what I wish to focus on. In apartheid South Africa, freedom of the press was not something guaranteed, and more often than not, the press was actively pushed down by the heavy hand of censorship when dissent arose. Let's define censorship. Censorship is the suppression of free speech, public communication, or other information which may be considered objectionable, harmful, sensitive, politically incorrect, or inconvenient as determined by governments or other authorities. This is usually directed at publishing institutions or media outlets, but can also include individual people and private organizations. Oxford University Press was directly affected by censorship like this. According to Penn State, journalists couldn't publish any news that was considered controversial if the government news sources hadn't covered it yet. News agencies weren't allowed to cover any news that the government didn't want them to, mostly enforceable by the law. The purpose of this project is to highlight the change in attitude about apartheid through a variety of vectors. One vector is literature, and how different South African writers used their words to show the truth of apartheid to the masses. What made the literature so powerful was the censorship of the publishing houses that the nationalist government attempted to instill through legislature. The nationalist government of South Africa was composed of white Afrikaners who wished the power of the country to serve their interests and promote their culture. One way to ensure that their agenda was the only agenda being followed or advertised was through censorship of the media and news, as well as different literary agencies. If they could control the ideas being spread, things would stay the same. This suppression of free press and free ideas created an internal resistance movement that was invigorated in the 80s by the township uprisings. Journalists and writers used loopholes in the law to bypass censorship, but this only caused the nationalist government to clamp down harder. Then began the resistance of fiction writers and autobiographers alike. Nadine Gordimer was an activist and writer in apartheid South Africa. She was friends to Nelson Mandela and his entourage, as well as an involved member in education and politics. She joined the African National Congress when it was still listed as an illegal organization by the nationalist government, knowing that it was the best shot at ending apartheid, though it wasn't perfect. Gordimer had many of her books banned, some for decades, others for only months. The Burger's Daughter and July's People were banned, and even to this day, July's People is still censored by the government for being quote-unquote racist and inflammatory, something Gordimer is deeply offended by. She received a Nobel Prize for Literature in 1991. Another author who was prevalent in South African literature was J. M. Coetzee, a renowned activist and scholar who worked tirelessly in the anti-apartheid movement. He wrote prolifically about the censorship in the country and how the government used history, its control of the media, and news as a way of forcing people to forget the history of the country and its racist past. Coetzee did not have his books banned, but he did get a front-row seat in the censorship of the country. In 1997, he released a series of essays about his views on censorship and how it affected not only his life, but the lives of many other writers of the time. In Coetzee's mind, censorship was the paranoid response of the dominant class that the suppressed would tell the truth that would offend the oppressor. From another perspective, apartheid was accepted by the masses through the proliferation of works such as James McClure's Kramer and Zondi novels. These presented two detectives, one Afrikaner and one Zulu, who would face crime after crime, yet Zondi was never seen on the same level as Kramer, always assumed to be less capable. While the Kramer and Zondi novels discussed issues of race and class, they did so through the lens of apartheid. This is the other aspect of censorship that is often forgotten, the rhetoric of the common sense and the perpetuation of hegemony or the prevailing and dominating culture. When there is a lack of literature that opposes the status quo, there is going to be some mechanism that reinforces what already exists. These ideas of racism and separate development are not extra-societal, they are the core foundations of the entire system. One person we can never forget in the fight against apartheid is Stephen Biko, an activist and writer who was killed in police custody. After his death, a book was published of his writing titled I Write What I Like. Before his death, Biko himself was banned and forced to stay in the magisterial district of King Williamstown. This did not deter him from continuing his activism. The resistance to this hegemony was not only expressed through literature, it also came in the form of art. This image here is a poster produced in the United States calling for the freeing of Nelson Mandela from prison. The resistance to apartheid was starting to leak internationally, so far that the United States was beginning to take a stand for quote-unquote human rights. Other forms of art came out and they often depicted things of a more unpleasant nature or more striking ideas. After the Sharpeville Massacre in 1960, motivations for artists to resist began to grow exponentially. The government began classifying art as either protest or resistance art. Images like Africa Guernica, painted by Dumiel Feni in 1967. Other arts, like sculptures, tried to capture the essence of the era metaphorically. The Butcher Boys by Jane Alexander is one such sculpture that presented the ideals that the violence in South Africa was bestial, cruel, and dehumanizing. This is a stunning example of resistance art in the year 1986. Protest art was critical at not only preserving the history of apartheid that wasn't getting written, but also spreading stories to those who had no access to information. If there was no message of resistance, there would not be any. As Stephen Biko said, the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. Art was another vector through which black consciousness and pride began to grow. Overall, it seems that the censorship of apartheid South Africa was driven by the brutality of a minority government and its need for control. The division of power was one kept by force and normalization of the idea of separation. A divided country is easier to handle than one united people, and the censorship of African voices kept things divided. People like Hendrik Verwoerd and P.W. Botha were at the heads of these ideals, but there were far more people who bought into the idea of apartheid and perpetuated it. The resistance was building, and it would boil over quickly, something that men like them did not want to happen. The status quo was being challenged, and there was no way for them to stop it. How powerful art was to garner resistance to apartheid is something that is well documented, and as history has shown, trying to extinguish that resistance only makes it grow. Though most of the push came from top down, those affected by apartheid pushed back just as hard with mind, body, and soul.